The night of November 13th, 1942. Iron Bottom Sound, Guadalcanal. The destroyer Amatsukaze was running at full speed through the darkness, her guns trained forward, her captain on the bridge watching the shapes of American ships appear and disappear in the black water ahead. Commander Hara Tameichi gave the order to fire. His ship performed exactly as she had been built to perform. The engagement lasted minutes. When it was over, he had won. That night, back in his cabin, Hara opened his journal and wrote, not about the victory, not about the ships he had helped sink. He wrote that Japan was losing the war. He was a destroyer captain who had just won a battle in a campaign that his navy was, by every official measure, winning. And he wrote in a private journal that none of it was going to be enough. Why would a man write that? The answer is in what Hara saw that the official reports did not say, in what he kept writing through 2 more years of war, and in what he finally put into print after it was over, in a book that said things no Japanese naval officer was supposed to say. Hara fought in more than 30 naval engagements between 1942 and 1945. He survived all of them. He was present at some of the most consequential battles of the Pacific War, and through all of it he was watching and writing down what he saw. This is the story of what he wrote, and why it still matters. To understand what Hara was seeing, you have to understand what he was. He was not an admiral, he was not a strategist in a Tokyo headquarters, moving pins across a map. He was a destroyer captain, a man whose professional life had been built around the specific, unglamorous work of taking a fast ship into dark water and doing violence at close range. In the Imperial Japanese Navy of 1942, that was a particular kind of expertise. Japan had built its naval doctrine around the night. The logic was straightforward. The United States could outbuild Japan. More ships, more aircraft, more of everything a long industrial war required. Japan could not match that output. What Japan could do, what it had spent 20 years training its sailors to do, was fight in conditions where industrial output mattered less and individual skill mattered more. The dark, the close range, the sudden engagement over before the larger force could bring its numbers to bear. Destroyer captains were the specialists of that doctrine. The long lance torpedo, the Type 93, was the weapon around which the night fighting doctrine was built. It ran faster, hit harder, and reached farther than anything the Americans had. In the hands of a skilled crew on a dark night, at the right range, the results could be decisive. Hara was one of those skilled crews. He had spent years learning the geometry of night combat, the angles, the timing, the reading of shadow and silhouette that told you where a ship was and where it was going. The record of his early engagements confirms it. Guadalcanal began in August of 1942, when American Marines landed on the island and began the fight for Henderson Field. The airstrip that both sides understood would determine who controlled the surrounding waters. The Japanese Navy responded with what became known informally as the Tokyo Express. High-speed nighttime runs down the slot. The narrow passage between the islands of the Solomons, delivering troops and supplies to the garrison on Guadalcanal. Destroyers were the workhorses of this operation, fast enough to make the run in darkness, armed well enough to handle whatever the Americans sent against them, at least in the early months. In the night actions of late 1942, the Japanese destroyer force performed well. The Battle of Savo Island in August had demonstrated what Japanese surface forces could do at night. 4 Allied cruisers sunk in 32 minutes, with no Japanese ships lost. The engagements through October and November continued the pattern. Japanese destroyers ran the slot. They delivered. They fought when they had to. They won more than they lost. Hara was part of this. He ran the slot. He fought, he won, and he started noticing things that the victory reports did not mention. The first thing he noticed was the air. Guadalcanal was being decided not only at night on the water, but during the day in the sky. Henderson Field gave American aircraft a base from which they could strike Japanese ships in daylight. The Tokyo Express ran at night precisely because the days had become dangerous. But the days were also when American resupply happened. Ships moving supplies to Guadalcanal under air cover from Henderson Field. The Japanese could contest the waters at night. They could not contest the air during the day. And it was daytime air cover that was allowing the American position to strengthen while the Japanese position weakened. He wrote about this in his journal, not in a formal report. Formal reports emphasized what was going right. In his journal, he wrote that Japan was winning the nights, but not the days, and that Guadalcanal was ultimately going to be decided by whoever controlled the days. The second thing he noticed was the counting. Every time a Japanese ship was sunk, he watched to see what replaced it. Every time an American ship was sunk, he watched to see what replaced that. The Americans replaced their losses faster. Not immediately. The early months were costly for both sides. But the trend was visible if you were watching the trend rather than the most recent engagement. A man who has just won a battle is not naturally inclined to count the enemy's replacements. He is inclined to count his own kills. Hara counted both. The third thing he noticed was subtler. The Americans were getting better, not just at individual skills, though that was happening too. They were getting better at coordination, at using information, at positioning their forces for engagements that played to their strengths rather than to the strengths of the Japanese. In August, the Americans had been surprised repeatedly. By November, they were being surprised less often. Something was changing on their side, something that was not just a matter of ships and weapons, but of how those ships and weapons were being used. None of this appeared in official Japanese assessments. The official picture emphasized the tactical victories, the ships sunk, the supplies delivered, the engagements won. It did not look at the direction those things were moving. It did not ask whether tactical victories were producing strategic results. Hara looked at the direction. He asked whether it was working. His conclusion, reached in the autumn of 1942 and recorded in a journal no superior officer would ever read, was that it was not working. The campaign was consuming Japanese resources at a rate that could not be sustained, delivering results that were real but insufficient, moving toward an outcome the tactical picture was being used to obscure rather than illuminate. He kept showing up. He kept running the slot. He kept fighting, winning individual engagements, and writing in his journal at the end of them. By the spring of 1943, Hara had a new ship, Shigure, a destroyer launched in 1935, unremarkable in her specifications, distinguished entirely by what would happen to her over the next 2 years. Hara took command of Shigure in early 1943 and began the same work, running convoys, escorting transports, fighting when intercepted. What he was writing in his journal was changing. In 1942, his entries had been observations, things he noticed, patterns beginning to form. In 1943, the entries became confirmations of a conclusion he had already reached, the night of August 6th and 7th, 1943. Vella Gulf, a Japanese force of 4 destroyers, Arashi, Hagekaze, Kawakaze, and Shigure, was running supplies to the garrison at Kolombangara. Hara was commanding Shigure, the last ship in the column. What the Japanese force did not know was that 6 American destroyers were waiting, not positioned by chance, positioned by information, radar contacts tracked from a distance, bearings calculated, an ambush set with time to spare. The Americans launched their torpedoes before the Japanese knew they were there. Arashi went down. Hagekaze went down. Kawakaze went down. Shigure, at the rear of the column, had just enough warning from the explosions ahead to take evasive action. She took hits. She did not sink. Hara brought her home. In his journal that night, he wrote about the ambush, specifically about what it told him. The Americans had known the Japanese force was coming. They had known its composition, its route, its timing. They had not intercepted. They had ambushed. The distinction matters. An interception requires you to find the enemy. An ambush requires you to already know where the enemy will be. Hara had understood since Guadalcanal that American radar was improving. Vella Gulf told him something more specific. The Americans had learned not just to detect Japanese forces at night, but to use that detection to build a tactical picture complete enough to plan around. This was not just better equipment, it was better integration. Radar feeding information to commanders who had learned to trust it and act on it before visual confirmation was possible. He wrote that this was the kind of advantage that did not go away. A ship could be sunk and replaced. A radar set could be damaged. But the practice of building a tactical picture from available information and acting on it decisively, that was a skill being developed at the institutional level on the American side, and it would be present in every engagement from that point forward. He was right. Through the autumn of 1943, Hara continued to fight and to write. The second pattern he documented was the torpedoes. Early in the war, American torpedoes had been notoriously unreliable. The Mark 14, the standard American destroyer and submarine torpedo, ran too deep, failed to detonate, or detonated prematurely. American after-action reports from the early war years are full of accounts of torpedoes that should have sunk ships and didn't. Japanese sailors knew this. It was a reasonable assessment that one of the American Navy's primary offensive weapons was not performing as intended. By mid-1943, Hara was noticing that American torpedoes were behaving differently. The failures common in early engagements were becoming rare. American torpedo attacks were producing results more consistent with what the weapon was designed to do. He wrote about this carefully. As a man who understood that what he was observing had implications he did not want to be right about. An unreliable American torpedo had been a partial equalizer. It meant American numerical and production advantages were offset by weapon failure rates. A reliable American torpedo meant that offset was gone. The third pattern was the most difficult to articulate. The American sailors and pilots he was fighting in late 1943 were not the same as the ones he had fought in late 1942, not individually, collectively. In the early months of the war, American forces had often responded to Japanese tactics slowly or incorrectly. The night-fighting doctrine that had made the Tokyo Express possible had worked in part because the Americans had not yet developed reliable counters to it. By late 1943 they had, not perfect counters, but responses that were faster, better coordinated, and more likely to impose costs on Japanese forces, even when those forces were executing their doctrine well. Hara wrote that this kind of improvement, collective, institutional, was the most dangerous thing he was observing. Individual bravery could not be trained away. Individual skill could not be trained away. But institutional learning, the ability of an organization to take what it was experiencing in combat and translate it into changed practice across the fleet. That was something the Americans appeared to be doing, and the Japanese appeared not to be doing at anywhere near the same rate. There was one more thing Hara recorded in this period. He was watching his contemporaries die, not in the abstract sense that men die in war, in the specific sense that the officers he had trained alongside, fought alongside, understood the doctrine alongside, were being lost at a rate the replacement system was not keeping pace with. The men who replaced them were younger, less experienced, and had not had the years of peacetime training that had made the pre-war Japanese destroyer force as capable as it was. Hara did not write about this as a morale problem. He wrote about it as a capability problem. The doctrine his navy was fighting with had been developed by men who no longer existed in sufficient numbers to execute it at the level it required. The replacements were brave. They were willing. They were not ready. And there was no honest way, inside the reporting structure Hara operated within, to say that. So he said it in his journal, and kept going. By the end of 1943, Hara and Shigure had developed a reputation that was equal parts admiration and unease among the men of the destroyer force. She survived Vella Gulf. She survived Kolombangara. She survived Vella la Vella. At Empress Augusta Bay in November, where the cruiser Sendai was sunk and several destroyers were lost, Shigure came through again. When Hara wrote about Empress Augusta Bay, he did not write about what he had done right. He wrote about the men on the ships that had not come back. He had known some of them for years, trained alongside their captains, fought alongside their crews. They were gone. He was not, and he found, sitting in his cabin writing about it, that he could not fully explain why. He was skilled. He was prepared. His judgment under fire was as good as anyone's in the destroyer force, but he had also been last in the column at Vella Gulf, which is not a function of skill. He had made decisions at Empress Augusta Bay that he would have described afterward as reasonable, but not obviously superior to the decisions made by officers who did not come back. What he was grappling with, and recording in his journal with a precision that must have been uncomfortable to achieve, was the recognition that survival is not always earned. Sometimes it is positional. Sometimes it is the accumulated result of decisions none of which were individually decisive, but which collectively put you in a place where the night's violence passed over you rather than through you. He wrote that this recognition made survival feel like an obligation. If he was alive, when others who deserved to be alive were not, then what he did with the time he had carried a weight it would not have carried if survival had simply been a matter of being better. He kept writing. He kept writing down what he saw, not as an act of defiance, as obligation. October 24th into the 25th, 1944. Surigao Strait, Philippines. Hara was commanding Shigure, the last destroyer in the column of Vice Admiral Nishimura's southern force, the same position she had occupied at Vella Gulf a year earlier. Last in the column, trailing the force into the strait. The ships ahead of him were Yamashiro, Fuso, and a handful of other destroyers. They were sailing into a passage that American intelligence had mapped completely, that American radar was watching in real time, and that Admiral Oldendorf's battleships and cruisers were waiting at the far end of, arranged in a line across the northern exit. Hara did not know all of this, but he had spent 2 years writing about exactly this kind of situation. He had written about radar that could see in the dark. He had written about American forces that positioned themselves before the Japanese arrived rather than reacting after contact. He had written about the gap between what Japanese doctrine assumed and what American capability had become. What he was sailing into on the night of October 24th was all of those things simultaneously. The Fuso was hit first. A torpedo struck her. The precise source remains disputed in post-war accounts. And she began to burn. Then she broke apart. The two halves of a battleship drifting separately through the darkness, both on fire. Hara saw it from Shigure's bridge. He did not write about what it looked like. He wrote about what it meant. The Fuso was one of the most heavily armored ships in the Japanese fleet. She had been built to absorb punishment. She was burning in two pieces in a strait the force had not yet fully entered. The column kept moving. Nishimura, on Yamashiro ahead, had acknowledged the loss and continued north. Hara followed. Yamashiro sailed into the concentrated fire of 6 American battleships that had been tracking her by radar for most of the night. The American guns were not aimed at where Yamashiro was. They were aimed at where she was going to be. Yamashiro fought back. Her crews did not abandon their stations. They loaded and fired throughout the engagement, doing exactly what they had been trained to do. The shells they fired went into the darkness. None of them found American ships. At 4:19 in the morning, Yamashiro rolled and went under. Nishimura went with her. Hara was watching from the rear of the column. He had seen Fuso burn and break apart. He had seen Yamashiro fight and die. He had watched the destroyers ahead of him engage and be destroyed before they could accomplish anything decisive. He was now at the entrance to Surigao Strait with one ship, facing a line of American battleships. He turned Shigure around. This decision has been discussed and second-guessed in the accounts of Surigao Strait written over the decades since. Some have called it pragmatic. Some have called it the only rational choice given that the rest of the force had been destroyed. What Hara wrote about it afterward was not a justification. It was a description. He wrote that he turned around because there was nothing left to go forward with, and nothing that going forward alone could accomplish. He did not feel, in that moment, that he was saving Shigure. He felt that he was the last man standing in a room where everyone else had already died, and that walking out of the room was not triumph. He brought Shigure home. She was the only ship of Nishimura's southern force to return from Surigao Strait. In the days that followed, Hara sat down with his journal. He had been writing in it for 2 years, about radar, about torpedo improvements, about replacement sailors who were not ready, about the widening gap between Japanese and American capability. He had not written, until now, what it felt like to watch a force he was part of be destroyed by exactly the conditions he had spent 2 years documenting. He wrote that Surigao Strait was not a surprise, not to him. He had not known the specific details, the specific positions, the specific forces waiting, but he had known the shape of it. He had described the shape of it, in general terms, many times, in a journal that no one in a position to change anything had ever read. That was the weight he carried out of Surigao Strait. Not guilt, not the grief of a survivor who cannot explain why he is alive and others are not. Something colder, the knowledge that the outcome had been predictable, that men had died in a trap that the pattern of the previous 2 years had made visible to anyone watching carefully, and that watching carefully had not been enough. He kept writing through the remaining months of the war. He was at sea when Japan surrendered. When it was over, he faced a different question. What do you do with 2 years of notes about the gap between the official record and what actually happened? Most Japanese naval officers who survived the war wrote nothing. Some wrote memoirs that attributed Japan's defeat to factors beyond anyone's control: American industrial output, the atomic bombs, the weight of material that no amount of skill or courage could have overcome indefinitely. These explanations were not wrong. They were incomplete. Hara wrote something different. In 1961, 16 years after the war ended, he published the account that had been building since the night he sat in his cabin on Amatsukaze and wrote that Japan was losing while the men on the ships around him were celebrating. The book was called Japanese Destroyer Captain. It was translated into English and published in the United States, where it found readers among naval officers and historians who recognized immediately that it was not like other accounts of the Pacific War written by officers from the losing side. The difference was not tone, Hara did not write with bitterness or the defensiveness of a man protecting his reputation. The difference was honesty about causes. Most post-war accounts by Japanese officers treated the tactical record as the primary subject. Ships sunk, engagements won, specific decisions and their immediate results. Hara went upstream. He wrote about the torpedo problem, not the specific failures of specific weapons, but the structural failure of a system that could not admit its weapons were not performing and therefore could not fix them. American torpedoes had been unreliable early in the war. American officers had reported this. The Navy investigated, found the problems, and corrected them. Japanese torpedoes had been among the best in the world at the start of the war. Japanese officers had been trained to assume they would remain so. He wrote about the replacement problem, not as a lament for the dead, but as a systematic analysis of what happens when an institution trains its best people, sends them into combat, and has no plan for when those people are gone. Japan had built a pre-war destroyer force of extraordinary capability. That capability lived in the men who had developed it over years. When those men died, the capability died with them. The replacements were sent into the same situations with a fraction of the preparation. He wrote about the reporting problem, the system in which the incentive was to report the most favorable interpretation of events rather than the most accurate one, in which officers who delivered unwelcome assessments found those assessments unwelcome, in which the picture of the war that reached decision-makers was systematically more optimistic than the picture available to anyone actually present at the engagements. None of this was comfortable to publish in Japan in 1961. The war was 16 years in the past, but the men Hara was writing about were in many cases still alive. Their families were still alive. Hara published anyway. He was careful to be precise rather than accusatory. He named what had gone wrong without turning the account into a verdict on individuals. But the analysis was clear. He wrote that Japan had not lost the war primarily because America was stronger. America was stronger, enormously, finally, decisively stronger. But Japan had accelerated its own defeat through institutional failures that compounded the underlying disadvantage into something far worse than it needed to be. Pilots and sailors sent into combat before they were ready. Assessments that obscured the actual situation from the people who needed to understand it. A doctrine that had been correct at the start of the war and had become incorrect as the war developed. But that could not be revised because revising it would have required admitting it was no longer correct. The book found a larger audience in the United States than in Japan, among people professionally interested in how navies learn and fail to learn from experience. That audience understood what Hara had done. He had produced something rare in the literature of any war, an account written by a participant who had understood what was happening while it was happening, had recorded that understanding at the time, and was now presenting the record with the benefit of having been right. Not triumphantly right. There was nothing to be triumphant about. Right in the way that makes you wish, for the sake of the men who died, that someone had read what you were writing when it might still have mattered. Hara lived to see the war assessed and reassessed by historians with access to records from both sides. Long enough to see the analysis he had written in real time, confirmed by archival work of people who had spent careers examining what he had observed in hours. It did not appear to bring him satisfaction. What he had written about, in the end, was not about being right. It was about the cost of being right in a situation where being right and having the ability to act on what you were right about were two entirely different things. He had seen the shape of the outcome. He had written it down. He had kept fighting because there was nothing else to do. The men on Yamashiro had not known what was waiting in Surigao Strait. The men on Fuso had not known. The destroyer crews who ran the Tokyo Express had not known that the pattern of their victories was not producing the results the victories were supposed to produce. Hara had known, or close enough to knowing that the distinction does not much matter at the distance of 80 years, and the knowledge had not saved any of them. That is the thing his journal recorded that the official history could not. Not the outcome, not the tactics, not the numbers. The distance between understanding something and being able to do anything about it. The night of November 13th, 1942, Iron Bottom Sound, Amatsukaze fires. Hara wins the engagement. He goes below. He opens his journal. He writes that it is not enough. He was right. He kept writing. Nobody who could have changed anything was reading. That is what the journal was for. And that is why, all these years later, it still has something to say.